being here with us. Just to introduce week 2 of our Embodied series. We've had a really beautiful time over the past week, kind of uncovering some of the unique experiences with artists and thinkers and creatives and engaging on how we can show up more thoughtfully and creatively. And so as we kind of enter into week 2 of our series, we're obviously really grateful to have you here to share space with us, engaging in the idea of creative community and exploring what that means within your own work. So probably going to start off with talking a little bit about your transition from your corporate job into your creative practice as it is now, but just give everybody a little bit of a rundown on who you are and where you find yourself.
Sure, perfect. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here to be able to talk about some of these things. I think it's going to be a really interesting and wicked conversation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ali. I live in the UK in a city called Bristol, which is probably one of my favorite cities in the world. I'll go as far as to say. Can't say I fully transitioned. I still work in my corporate job, but on the side slash almost with as much importance. I am involved quite heavily in the music industry. I am a DJ. I run a record label. It's called Eat My Beat, which I run with a good friend of mine called Chris, who is somewhere in this call, which we started with another couple of friends of ours, our close-knit community that all met back in Reading University some time ago, back in 2010, 11. And I guess I've always been highly interested in music. Like, it's been something that I've been involved in from, ever since growing up. My parents really weren't the drivers for that. I guess it was through my brother and sister that I really started getting into music. They were a little bit ahead of me, and I sort of was like, yeah, what's this? What's this amazing thing? So yeah, I basically started DJing. I guess it would be around 2013, 2014 is when I started taking it seriously. Was just used to mess around on the computer. I'm one of those people that came into it from the technology point of view. So can't say I came into it through the love of vinyl and spinning decks, but I started just from using some virtual digital platforms. There's some good ones that were circulating around back in the day, and a DJ controller, and sort of just taught myself how to do it, which was, yeah, a process and took some time to finesse, but maybe 6 or 7 years down the line now, I'd like to think that I'm pretty good at it.
That's interesting. I'm going to transition to kind of take from what you said there and transition into the bit about your interpretation of the word creative, and that really stuck, and that you didn't necessarily identify yourself as someone whose creativity was innate. Can you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's something to do with like what I thought society's idea of creativity was. So if we just go back to schooling days, what I thought was creativity was art or music, like playing instruments, for example, or creative writing. I never really thought that things like playing sport or being a playmaker in sport or some other avenues that weren't necessarily openly and publicly valued. I never really saw them as creative avenues. So I think I probably always demeaned my creative ability. And given that my background is in science, I always saw the two things sort of as conflicting. You're either a scientist or an artist.
Yeah.
God forbid that you ever try and be both at the same time.
You feel differently about that now?
Yeah, well, I've gone full circle and just thought, why not give it a shot, right? And I think it's all just about finding your creative medium. Um, I also really enjoy writing lyrics, writing both grime and hip hop lyrics. Really, it's just about freedom of expression, and it's something that I was able to find through music, and specifically through weaving together tunes and stories, and from that, perhaps creating something new.
Yeah, that's interesting because that kind of like has me thinking about the idea that we are the conduits of creative work, and that you said something really interesting. Again, you said a lot of really interesting things, but one of the that stuck with me particularly was the idea that we're just allowing the art to move through us, and that it's the expression of
Mm,
performance was, I think, what you'd said, which I thought was kind of cool. But that's going to take me to my next point about asking what your experience was being Black and working in the corporate world, or what your experience is being a Black man working in the
mm,
corporate world, particularly within the science world, and the kind of lack of diversity and the lack of representation. We know we come from a long history of Black
mm.
people and men that are so pivotal in that industry, but why we don't see ourselves represented is, yeah, concerning. And maybe Steph might have something to say around this topic as well.
Mm. Yeah, it's quite an interesting point that you raise, actually. Just in terms of science, like, I don't think, again, there's a lot of visibility of Black role models in science. You know, I had to, after becoming interested in science, go on to find out about some, very notable Black scientists and mathematicians who are involved in, some of the most profound things out there, like, you know, some people like George Washington Carver, who was responsible for, moving away from using cotton as a common crop, and there are other astrophysicists like Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's a lady whose name has slipped my mind, but she was responsible for, basically carrying out the first calculations that enabled space travel. So these were sort of buried under the covers of, I guess, the white supremacist system, like, which was much more likely to promote white scientists. So coming into the corporate world and coming up through science, especially in the UK, I found that there weren't a lot of people that looked like me. We were fewer in the demographic. I can't say that we were completely excluded. Fortunately, I guess is one way of looking at it. People from, at least people who have second generation who've emigrated to this country, with parents who understood what it was like to fit in. We knew we had to work twice as hard, and this sort of meant that we were taught to excel in terms of education, just to try and pave a name for ourselves, which might be the case for a lot of other people, but I think that the opportunities were stacked against us.
Yeah.
So yeah, coming into it and finally sort of finding myself working within the industry was very interesting. I had to sort of learn how to navigate these spaces. I had to learn how to speak the lingo, and there was an air at the beginning of definitely trying to mold myself to sort of fit in. It took a lot of self-reflection and a lot of self-confidence building to really just embrace my authentic self and to let that side of me shine, which is definitely where I'm at today. But it did take some time to get here.
Mm. Yeah, because you mentioned that your mom's from North Africa, isn't it? And that, um, correct me if I'm wrong, but then she had made a statement like, "How were you going to be successful in white England? Like, there's certain like maybe ways that when you come to a new country, that adjustments that have to be made." And yeah, that obviously speaks true to your experience, but
Yeah, exactly. My parents came over from, my dad is from Kenya, my mum is from Tanzania. They emigrated to the UK in the I'd say late 70s, early 80s, just as the British were withdrawing from East Africa. And, you know, racism back then was much more in your face. It was much more direct. You know, people were, and I'm sure in areas it's still like that, but you know, I haven't had to face the same degree of direct racism that I think my parents had to face. And, you know, I remember from a very early age, 5, 6, just constantly being told at how much more we would have to do just to reach not only the same point, but if we were to even fathom trying to reach a further point, then the people who were sort of deemed to be at the highest point in society, we would have to go above and beyond.
Mm. And so do you think that kind of working your way throughout the system towards the science world, that there were necessary like kind of decisions that you made along the way? What kind of adjustments were you making to yourself along, whether it be language or whether it be sometimes we like as a woman doing my hair in different hairstyles to try kind of, you know, make white people feel comfortable, and in other ways, to be honest, to make myself feel comfortable as well, to not have to
Yeah.
be the object of the gaze, you know?
It's a really powerful thing that you just said about appearance, actually, because you know people start judging you from the second that they look at you. It's maybe a natural thing; it's a human thing. You know, I didn't look like this when I attended university, and in my late schooling years, I always had my hair very short. Um, and you know, it was something that again stemmed from my parents' understanding of, you know, you need to look sharp and clean, otherwise people just will automatically not respect you or take your opinion seriously. And I
Yeah.
found my approach probably at the beginning was to just stay more quiet
Mhm.
and keep my ears open and listen to people and not really push my agenda forward, which, yeah, I guess is it's not an ideal situation, but I found that it ended up giving me a lot of benefit because, you know, it meant that I was very observant of how people spoke and the sort of topics that people would speak about and how they would speak about these things. And it just meant that I guess I was able to find my place without much without many barriers. Perhaps if I'd been more outspoken at the beginning, I would have had a completely different experience. But who's to say?
No, absolutely. I'm gonna draw on Stefan for a second because I want to hear his input on this as well. Being somebody that's lived in the UK as well and is
Mm.
navigating the corporate world both in the UK and in the US, and that both of you now have dreads, so that's interesting.
I,
Resisting barriers in the most obvious way.
are you typecasting us right now? Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And Kat, thank you for introducing, creating, and holding space for us. This has been good so far. I was hoping not to speak so early or at all, but thanks for
Plug you in.
But so what came to mind when you asked that question was just how everything starts as a function and then evolves into being a construct, and that's for better for worse. And so, you know, the corporate world, the business world started as a function, like it was supposed to hold its place in society as the epicenter of commerce, right? And then it becomes this construct which then embeds itself into culture and you become a business person. And so being Black in the business world becomes this performative art where you're introducing yourself to a new culture that you weren't raised on or connected to or conditioned into. And you realize that there are certain levers for change and for progress and also for performance management. And so, as Ali's already alluded to, even the very language and the way you carry yourself, aside from just appearances, all this trying to fit into the mold. And so I think it's been interesting to see, you know, him speak about it because my trajectory has been the same of like finding myself as a sort of Trojan and like falling into the space and then actually coming out and blossoming into who I actually am. And I still don't know if I've rectified that in myself as that being like a good thing or a bad thing, but it's what's worked. And so, moving forward, I'm trying to think about how we can be smarter with allowing ourselves to appear as we want to earlier on.
Absolutely. And giving ourselves autonomy. It's often, especially if you're the only Black person in a workplace, a lot of times your coworkers or your manager wants you to speak on behalf of all Black people in the world. And that's, firstly, it's not fair. Secondly, it's important for us to mention that as Black people, our cultural experiences are diverse, they're varied, they're colorful, and they're global. And there's no way that we can speak on behalf of each other. Surely we have things that tie us together just by nature of who we are and our race, but especially within our different cities, our experiences are so varied. About that. But yeah, the thinking about the changes that have to be made when coming to a new country and kind of transitioning into the difference between Black as a race and Black as culture. And I think it was Ta-Nehisi Coates that said, as Black, yeah, we do have race and we do have culture, and for some people, their experiences don't have both of those things, and that's not a bad thing. You know what I mean? You'll be Black even if you didn't, and you still are Black even if you weren't raised around a lot of Black people. So that brings me to my next point about you being kind of your main influence growing up having been Islam, and that a lot of models were just kind of centered around Islam and not like American Black culture of hip hop and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because while my parents were always saying these things to us about how we had to work harder and etc., that I already elaborated on, I didn't really see myself as disadvantaged in that way. I didn't think I am a Black person, therefore, whereas perhaps my brother and my sister took a different understanding to that. And as you mentioned, I think Islam was the more unifying factor, or the more unifying concept that sort of was more responsible for my identity, the development of my identity. And while Islam is from the outside perspective, you get the feeling that it's centered in the Arabian and perhaps African and perhaps East Asian cultures. But of course, there are Muslims all over the world. There are so many different flavors of Islam, and to try and like sort of fit into the mold of Islam is even a quite problematic idea in itself. But I guess for me, it meant that, I guess I already touched on it. It just wasn't the central tenet of my identity, my Blackness. And it wasn't until, probably much later in my life, when I started to move into the corporate world, that I became more aware of these things, because my eyes were open to it, and there were not a lot of people that looked like me. And I found it quite curious. I was really lucky to have grown up in the Middle East, in Qatar, and even in my school, there was like some 30, 40 nationalities. So, we were all heavily intermingled. And I guess I was quite fortunate to have that sort of multicultural upbringing. It was like living in a city, but in a school. So I was really glad to have got to have dialogue with all sorts of different people's backgrounds and cultures from a very early age.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about the future, and thinking about how we can be intentional about showing varied representations of ourselves. Like we've seen this happen a lot through photography and through a lot of visual media, but at large, when we often hear statements like, oh, you speak 2 languages, or like we said yesterday, like, oh, you are Black. And this is such a shocking thing for so many people, that you can Black and have all these different experiences that are outside of people's general ideas. So, maybe, the question is kind of how we can be, and anybody else feel free to jump in, but how can we be intentional about showing these varied representations of ourselves? And is it our job to do that, or whose job? And just not really sure.
Perhaps it has to start with us. And I think, society is going to be the framework for our ability to be able to do that. What is, what was more difficult 10, 20 or 10 years ago is perhaps easier nowadays, because of things like music and other creative platforms. We have more exposure to more people who have the Black experience. So there is perhaps a driver for us to be more authentically ourselves, and I think it's perhaps our responsibility to express ourselves in that way, but then it's also the responsibility of everyone else to be open to receiving many, to not put us in a box and to not see us as, a certain type of person just because we're a Black person. We can be more than just one thing.
Yeah, and it's difficult because, again, like, for so many years we haven't really been in charge of our own narratives.
Mm-hmm.
So when we hear and see a lot of people talking, even in the music industry that you're involved in, like, a lot of music critics don't have like a lot of the historical and sociocultural references to be able to do the music that we are involved in justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of specifically, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this, but the techno scene that you were mentioning previously, and that music like techno and house came out of America and came out of Chicago and Detroit, but it's so overrepresented by white people. And the people that write about it are predominantly white. So how do we kind of take back these narratives and make sure that we're the ones that are talking about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of see the music industry as like almost like a little microcosm of society. You have like different classes in these underground music scenes, and then you have, a media which is mainly populated by white people who are therefore more likely to express the experiences and the skill of white artists and white producers, white singers, songwriters. And, it's funny, like, I think I mentioned to you when we spoke before, when I looked into the music industry as a kid, I saw that mostly the Black people that were being represented were either MCs, or rappers, and that was the majority of it. And I think that's the case now as well, in sort of areas where people want to try and get into music, in the sort of more in areas where there's less money in the community. People are like, the way that I'm going to get out of here is through music, and the most likely avenue is through becoming a rapper or an MC. So it's really interesting that we've forgotten our roots, and we've forgotten that a lot of these genres were born out of, I guess, Black oppression and the opportunity for Black people to express their experience to the white public. I think it's also important to note, I think I was having a conversation with my partner about this yesterday, that, these musics were not born in a vacuum. So it's important to understand the socioeconomic context of how they came out as well. Like the conditions that bred the blues were very different to the conditions that bred hip hop. And that's why the music comes up so differently.
Yeah, no, for sure. Different sounds, different frequencies, different weights, and all these things have a really important like impressions based on, like you said, the environment, the context. Yeah, grime when you hear grime, like,
Yeah.
grime anywhere else but London, and I think that's important as well as a Londoner. I'm joking. Um, yeah, I'm thinking about your personal creative community with your group. Like, how important was it for you to carve out your own creative community, having had an experience where you were underrepresented, and whether the same feelings of underrepresentation of race carried through into the music scene, or if it felt a lot more expansive and freeing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think when I got into all of this, that wasn't really necessarily at the forefront of my mind. I wasn't really coming into developing our own creative platform in order to give Black people better representation in music. That's not really where I was coming from. It was more so about building community, and you know, I really recognized that it was quite difficult for budding producers and artists to get that public coverage. And there was so much talent, and it was really important from my point of view to be able to provide a space where, more eclectic sounds, more creative sounds were free to be expressed, because I don't think there were a lot of the bigger labels that were picking up these sounds. So I sort of, along with my colleague Chris, like we took it on ourselves to try and really represent for the underrepresented. And I don't think race was ever really even a thought, I would say, in that, and perhaps that's like something which is systemic to, it's a reflection of the issues that we're seeing. The fact that we weren't even considering that is potentially a problem. But it was really, it was always from the beginning about building community, and I would say to this day it still really is. Like, you'll find that I'm one of the more social people at the party. I'll try and get around and speak to everyone, and I'll try and connect people, and it's really important for me in a world where I find a lot of the producers and the people who are sort of supporting this movement do tend to be quite, introverted and more quiet. And it's perhaps part of the framework of trying to express creativity in a saturated market, and I think that there is always a lot of people who have feelings of self-doubt and really want to, they want to be heard, just like in every other avenue. People do just want to be heard, right? And I sort of just wanted to be someone who was going to hear people and was going to make sure that other people could hear those people.
Mm. Speaking of wanting to be heard and hearing, I'm going to move a little bit into thinking about what we've experienced within the recent events. Because that kind of brings us toward your approach, which you'd mentioned on kind of taking a little bit more of an open approach. And that maybe in some ways stems from your experience of having grown up around predominantly white people. And maybe it doesn't, but I'm interested in kind of maybe what led you to take that approach, and how the kind of recent events have impacted you, and if they have largely, or what your thoughts are just on that and the approach that you've taken in engaging with the white community.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. Something's definitely sparked in me. I feel something very different to how I felt the entire time up until now, to be honest. I guess I'd sort of desensitized myself to trying to reach racial equality, because I was fortunate enough to be in a situation where, because of things like my financial and educational privilege, I was never directly victimized in terms of direct racism, even though obviously the larger framework of the system is definitely engineered that way. I don't personally feel like there were a lot of barriers in my way. And that might be something about my perspective, and it might be something about luck and opportunity. But, I was always ready to hear people out. And I'm very aware that other people had experiences that were very different to me. And in light of all of this stuff that's been going on, I'm so glad that it's finally happening. And I think, from my point of view, I've always just been like, oh, white people are talking about this now. Like, what's happening? That means that we can talk about it, because I think that was always the case. Like, if we tried to bring these things up, people would be like, oh, what do you mean? We live in England. It's 2020. There's no such thing as racism. What do you want about? I think that idea has definitely changed in people's minds now that there are so many more people who are speaking out about this. And in light of, like, you know, this huge tragedy, we're able to, like, perhaps the empathy has reached. And I think obviously this is all very much in the backdrop of coronavirus, health, economic crisis. And one part of me is like, it's kind of a shame that it took the world becoming close to shutdown for us to really realize what was going on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm glad it's happening. And I'm sort of, you know, just someone who wants to hold space for people, who wants to connect with people. I want to share what resources I have available. I want to be able to help people have discussions about this. I want to be able to connect with people through kindness and let people feel like they can talk to me about whatever's on their mind without feeling like, you know, I'm going to judge them, or that I'm going to immediately think that, oh, you're a racist because you said this, or, you know what I mean?
Of course. And I think people who've experienced extreme racism may not be able to distance themselves from their experience in order to provide perspective. And so I think, like, that again just speaks to our individual experiences and how we are or are not able to engage with other people during this time.
Exactly. Yeah. There's much less trauma in my life in relation to this topic. So, you know, having these discussions doesn't trigger anything that makes me want to, like, become reclusive or anything like that. If anything, it's the opposite. You know, it makes me want to open up even more. And I found myself becoming much more openly political. You know, I was always having these conversations with people, but actually using my platforms to express this content, this information, this is definitely a new thing.
Thinking about identity again, and if you've ever experienced feelings of guilt from not having this, it may sound a bit strange to say, but feelings of you're engaging with other Black people who have experienced extreme racism, have you felt a level of guilt around not being able to identify with those experiences and feeling like where do I sit in this whole conversation? What can I provide? What can I offer?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that. I've actually thought about this quite a bit. You know, like, just in terms of my outward stance, I'm like, given that I haven't necessarily been on the harsh receiving end of this, is it okay for me to openly call out white people? You know, like, is that a fair thing to say? Like, but I think that yes, because no matter what, this is the reality of the situation. Just because I haven't experienced that, I'm still very sympathetic to, you know, my Black brothers and sisters who have experienced that. And ultimately, I think that we're all one community, right? So if one person is suffering, we need to also suffer to take a little bit of that pain and try and turn it into something positive. So yeah, it's definitely something that I've thought about, but I wouldn't necessarily say I feel any sort of shame about it. You know, life is life. It deals you whatever cards that it chooses to deal you, and it's on you to then decide how you want to play those cards.
Mhm. No, for sure. And I think there's been a lot of and I feel like it may have been Franny that had brought this up in two conversations prior, talking about the kind of conflict that you can feel sometimes of, am I Black enough, based on not having a kind of Black cultural experiences for a lot of people, or being in Franny's case, like half Black, half Chinese.
Close. I am, I would say, like, half Chinese, right? And then my mother is multiracial, so she too has, like, that multi-hyphenate experience. That's not binary. So in the same ways, I kind of sit back, read the room, and like, move where I can towards least resistance always. I grew up in like the southern Gulf Coast of Florida, so it's very tumultuous of an existence, and I have been victimized and brutalized and vilified in accordance to whatever social norm preceded me. And that varies from your model minority Asian, right? Or where like you're gonna be smart in things and like that racism as positivity, to you know, it wasn't until I had already formed an identity of self that I came to personally experience racism as a subject. And so it was still alien, but I did kind of like go through that process where you rebel against other people's perceptions. And then you also realize you can't change them. So that took me some time as well. So you're like, well, do I go along with this? And then you kind of have to identify your Blackness as well. So like I had to learn about American Blackness because it was being prescribed or diagnosed to me. And me and Stefan share Baldwin as kind of like an interesting journeyer through that. He's super heavy to me, and like, so having lived that, it does make me recluse. Maya Angelou is like super eloquent in framing with these delicate words, and she has like this true Southern grace that obviously like speaks to me. Toni Morrison I haven't braved yet, but like there's so much of that. So yeah, sometimes I let it precede me, and I just see where that runs and see where that lies. But also now, like, I see where that has done me a disservice. I'm now finding the courage to not be blindsided by it and architect what I want from people and manage people on the front end, rather than being subject to somebody else's perceptions.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I was having a conversation about this with somebody earlier on today, particularly within the workplace, and just to kind of veer off, but I really appreciate what you said, Francis. That's like, that's really important to be able to just also hear really different perspectives and allowed to just, again, like just carve out your own narrative, because we haven't really been given the permission to do so. And yeah, so this conversation that I was having earlier today with a friend about being the only Black person in a workplace, and how challenging that can be, especially if you're not what the other people think you should be. And, you know, and especially within the hospitality industry, for me, having worked in jobs where I was the chef, but I was the only Black chef, and then all the other Black people that were working were either the kitchen porters or the servers, and just thinking about like growing up and that not really registering as a larger systemic issue, that it was difficult to make a connection between these series of moments until understanding how the whole thing worked. And maybe growing up, you kind of register them as just isolated incidents rather than work of a whole structure. And that's something that's kind of really only come to me in the past, I'd say 5 years. But necessarily looking at them as like isolated instances of an experience rather than actually this is a massive problem.
Yeah,
it's really hard to see it when you're in it, right? Like there's like a veil over your eyes, and you can only just, you know, you're turning up day to day, and you're like, oh, this is just how it is. And then afterwards you're like, oh, hold on a minute, why does it have to be like that? And it feels like it's difficult to challenge the framework, especially when you're in it.
And sometimes you're just happy to be there.
Yeah.
It took me really long to get here, so because this is, I worked hard for this. Do you know what I mean? There's that, and we were kind of talking a little bit about that martyrdom and that feeling of like we don't like I don't deserve this. Like, and it's something that I've struggled with a lot, of being able to take on opportunities, or being able to take praise, or being able to just own the space and say, do you know what? We belong here.
Mm.
Room of 100 other white people, I belong here, you know, where sometimes it doesn't always feel that way because of over and under representation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, like, if you have I guess role models who really instill in that idea in you that you can achieve, you are able to achieve, like, there might be barriers, but you are able to overcome that. If you're able to sort of cement that idea in your mind from a young age, you are able to, you know, sort of leap over some of those boundaries and really settle in those spaces, like, to recognize, yeah, I'm supposed to be here. Like, actually, like, if I can't be here, then there's something really, really wrong, you know?
Yeah.
Like, sorry, Stefan, I think I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
No, I was just musing as always.
Yeah.
If Kat can forgive me for sabotaging the conversation, I just want to go back quickly to, I think, what is looming underneath these sort of conversations, like in our deep reflection, what we're actually trying to point towards is what does change look like for the Black community.
Mm.
And I find it so interesting because I keep going back to what Mark said about in Jamaica, there is no Black community. So that is to say that being Black is an invention that was placed on us. It was something we inherited. We didn't create for ourselves, which comes off with a negative undertone. But what I mean to say is that there's this like gracious thought in that we can openly go forth and create ourselves and become what we want. And so going back to the earlier question you were introducing, Kat, with Ali, and that redefining what Blackness is, like, I think we have almost a impetus, if not a commission, to like really take it within ourselves, appreciate our individual responsibility in this conversation, and like create a version of us that isn't the label of Blackness that we were like thrown upon, you know. And that work is hard. Like, sometimes we're comfortable in it, sometimes it feels nice because it roots us in the world, but the bravery that it takes is contagious. And even in these conversations, even with seeing what you've been working on, it's just really refreshing to see Black people opening up what Blackness means for them.
Appreciate that. I have a question about what we think we can do to, like, physically and materially and tangibly create community for ourselves. And when we're thinking about, and this is actually a question for you, Ali, in terms of infrastructure, because that's a lot of the issue that we've seen in London particularly, is there was like a law passed about 15 years ago that was explicitly made to stop the kind of performance of grime music within London. And when people were filling out forms to try to perform at live bands, they would ask what ethnicity is your audience going to be, and it was explicitly to remove grime from the London scene. I'm just interested in terms of infrastructure, like how that's been for you accessing space, because that's a really big part of how we're going to be able to move forward, because so many, like we've seen, we don't really own a lot of the infrastructure. And so how are we going to be able to kind of pivot that?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you raised that point. Like, you know, especially with grime, it's like they tried to make grime synonymous with crime, so that there wasn't possibly going to be a gathering of Black people in a venue and something not go down, you know. So it's you know, these things, like, we remember these things. These things are like rooted in our psyche, and we also need to shake that understanding as well, because if we're constantly told that that's how things are, we then start to realize that that's how things are. And I'll use the example of being in the sort of circles that are all in the industry. Like, you find that you don't get a lot of artists supporting each other, you know. Like, it's kind of ruthless, I would say. You know, close friends support each other, but it's much more likely that you're pushing your own brand. And you know, people will share pictures of cats, but they'll not share pictures of your music. You know, it's interesting. Right now, whenever I do political posts, they get like 80 to 100 likes. And then I'll do a post about the next release that we're dropping, and it will get like 5 likes. And I know it's not about likes, obviously, but I'm just trying to make a point, right? Like, how come there isn't that same degree of support within these circles? Firstly, amongst the wider community, but then secondly, and more importantly, in this situation, amongst the Black community. You know, it's a ruthless world. Everyone's like, I've got to be successful. There's only a few spaces, so I'm going to be the one to fill that space. So what I've been seeing a lot of recently, I've been seeing a lot of like black artists, like, you know, putting out statements like, we're here to build, you know, I'm not here to break people down. And they've been just pushing the work of other artists within their circles, other Black artists specifically within their circles. It's really, really nice to see that. I think we need a lot more of that. Like, this is definitely a way that we're going to start to break through these barriers. Like, if we are not supporting ourselves, how can we expect other people to support us?
Yeah. And when you're so focused on looking up, you often don't have time to look around.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's quite hard to imagine like a clear set of tangible things that we can do to actually, you know, push this forward. I think that it's hard to do just from within our circles. Like, we will need support, we will need allyship from, you know, the white community. That's just the reality of the situation. Like, and I'm down with that. Like, I'm okay with that. As long as we're in a space where we're free to express our authentic self, then, you know, at the end of the day, I don't just want to exist in the Black community. I want to exist in the wider community. That's the end game, right?
Yeah, I know for sure. And we're in a really good moment now where opportunities are expanding. Even if these opportunities are reactionary, we're in a moment where hopefully we'll see a lot of these opportunities expand, and that it'll give us a wider opportunity for us to really express kind of all the things that we haven't really been able to, or, you know, we've had to create our own kind of smaller groups, and all of us within this space have gone out and done that, have created spaces for our communities, regardless of race. Because again, the idea that we are what is community for some of us may not be community for all of us. I guess that's where the ideas of subculture comes in, and we're arguably a part of a subculture of people who, you know, connect in very niche ways, but on a global scale. But I've been thinking a lot about that, about infrastructure. And that a lot of times we aren't necessarily equipped or informed with the language to communicate with people on these higher levels. And it's something I find really hard. I'm always asking Steph for words of how to write a document to a larger body, because I've never had to interact with people on this higher scale. I don't know how to ask these corporations for money. Like, and that's an actual barrier, an actual challenge. Oh, you have the things to provide, but you don't know how to ask for it.
It's a really powerful point that you've just raised. Yeah, like I'm fortunate enough to not have to have done that necessarily in that same capacity yet, but I can really understand how that's a difficult thing to do and to break through. Like, you're right. Where do you find the language for that? Like, we weren't prepared. We weren't taught these things.
Just send it. Pay me. Just pay me.
Yeah, if I can speak on that, I've definitely similarly, like, career-wise, focused scientifically, because those things that structure is finite to me, and most specifically, I just felt like we were all missing information about health and integration, and how as a Black community member you can stay healthy, right? Or even as an immigrant, because immigrant populations just have poor health outcomes, right? And so in terms of like tangible things and finding the language and the identity and and the tools is like, nutrition is a humongous part of like sustenance, right? If you don't have sustenance in your belly, you can't have food for thought. Yeah. And obviously in building an infrastructure, that's probably like my most baseline in regard to needs, because you have to meet needs first, right? Needs for survival. Yeah. And on a global scale, we have so much more room for diversity within our culture. Black culture especially, you'll find like we're fearful of trying new foods that are outside of our culture for social reasons and personal reasons. A lot of American people say that they have a texture thing. I don't really understand that, but there's all kinds of like social things, right, that you have to do to really get a proper nutrition, and that has to be a main objective first. And then you'll find that you'll feel more balanced, and you can be like more attuned to what you are feeling if you are meeting your basic needs, which is like shelter, food, and water, right? Which is like duh, but it's hard to do when you're emotionally stressed out. And everyone, like the whole world and the Black community especially, is under this duress, like this civil unrest that we all just don't speak about. We're all literally holding our breath. Some of us are on a hairpin trigger, right? Some of us don't feel like we have the agency to even speak up for ourselves. So then you have to navigate where your values are. And some of that starts so deep in regard to your identity, your value within your social structure, like the dynamics that you can't change. But once you get kind of past there, which I think for all of us, we've all sought like some community and some network and taken some action to building your own tribe. And I think that is like a level of agency when you reach that and you realize that you deserve that, and then you build your own framework, and you have like a room within the house. And that way, like when you step out into the world, you have these boundaries and setups to make you feel protected and fortified.
Yeah, I just quickly want to go back to what you're saying about tangible, observable, actionable things you can do to help build structures. Because it's funny, if Evan's listening in, feel free to chime in. But with him and you, Kat, we were speaking about what the term solidarity means. It's like, yeah, I want to hear that you are showing solidarity to me, but what does that actually even mean? How does that show up? And where this thread of conversation was going was just making me think about how important it is to introduce advocacy within solidarity, because advocacy is language. Like, I don't need you to stand in front of me and in a condescending way speak words through my mouth, but I need you to stand behind me and allow me to translate my needs.
Hold the mic for me.
Sorry?
Just hold the mic for me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like be there in these conversations with me. Like, help me write that proposal. Help me, get at the table, have a drink, grab coffee with that gatekeeper, because we simply don't have the tools. Like, we weren't equipped with the tools, and we're just trying to find our place in this very confusing climate.
Yeah.
And potentially the network as well. Like, actually having access to that network is something that potentially we find that isn't always the case. Like, maybe we find that if we are introduced to those people, we are able to make our own connections. But sometimes the just the appearance thing is a barrier to that. Yeah. So I think you were going to say something, Nadia.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of chime in really quick. We touched on this a little bit, and we talked about it in a different light, where when we were addressing the topic of everyone's individual role as we face the issues that we're in right now, and we discussed how everyone may have different objectives. If we apply that same framework of thought to how we can benefit our own networks, I think of it in the sense that, Kat, you mentioned us having these kind of connections that we do and coming from all these different places we often discuss. And I think it's really important to highlight that we all bring something unique and we all bring something extremely valuable. And the network that we build allows us to make connections with people that have different perspectives, different experiences, because the information is out there and somebody knows it. And the beauty of the connections that we make is unparalleled, because everybody's got some kind of different perspective. So as an example, I think about, I know you guys were talking about funding before, and we were talking about reaching out to these government entities. Personally, on a professional level, I've learned all the different programs and all the money that's available, for people to do such an array of things. The government is not coming to us to tell us these things. They're not approaching us to let us know. However, somebody in our network is aware, and somebody in our network, Kat, you mentioned speaking to Steph about something that he might have as a skill, right? Where you've got your unique skills, and this beautiful blend of everything that we bring individually is so incredibly important. We don't need one person to do everything. We need a community to do something beautiful, right?
For sure. I'm thinking about the ways that we're socialized through gender and funneled even within our experience to take up certain styles and types of work. And I think that is a lot of what strips us away from having access to language within certain genres of work, is that we are often funneled into, like, Black women are over proportionately represented within the mental health and social work field, as well as within. So that is, and that has nothing to do with the fact of, it has nothing to do with the idea that Black women can only be interested in certain things, but more so to do with the idea that we know that the access is open there and it's available. And there was a window of Black women that come from the Caribbean to Britain and America and Canada, because they were, you know what I mean? They were able to come over. And so even within our generation, it's like, if I'm looking around for people within my community to ask about the things that Nadia was talking about, they're very few and far between, which is just goes to the point of why I'm extremely grateful for communities like the ones that we have here with each other, regardless of our intricate disciplines. Because again, like Nadia said, we have such useful resources that we can build and use with each other and share and exchange. But Steph, I think you were about to say something, and I just went in.
No, I wasn't, but I will say, Nadia, you just exposed yourself and letting us know you can get us money. So we will all be coming to you following this call.
Hey man, listen, I'll do what I can, but no, it is truly incredible to see what's available, and it's exciting to know that these opportunities are there. And as we contribute to community and as we each show up in our own individual roles, money is only one thing. Kat mentioned mental health support. That's something else. There are so many things that each of us, like, look at this, even this is a group of 22 people with 22 different skill sets. And this connection that we're making is powerful. Very, very powerful.
Preach.
The deeper I get into this, the more I realize that it's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know. Because as long as you value your skill, as long as you find yourself in front of the right person, you are able to express that skill. And, I found that a lot of the progress that we've made, particularly in with Eat My Beat, has, obviously been from us non-stop pushing our sound and non-stop pushing ourselves, but it's those little connections. How can we find ourselves in the same spaces? How can we, and it's important that these spaces are safe spaces so that we're free to express, some of the stickier issues like you mentioned.
Yeah. And it's also important that, Steph.
Sorry. I was just going to say, so we've built a bit of a space here. What is something that we can do now to help push the Eat My Beat ethos and philosophy and sound forward?
Oh, wow. Share our stuff. Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I just genuinely nonstop push content. I think, especially in this world where there's so much content out there, it all just gets swallowed up. It's like throwing ideas into a chasm unless people like catch it and just give the little prop, just help it along a little bit. And I find that genuinely tends to have the most amount of impact. Yeah. Let me think about that for one more second, and I might have something more profound to say.
Have you with Eat My Beat, have you guys had to like really kind of change the method through which you create, or how has that been like as you transitioned into quarantine and into the crisis and through it, if you will?
Yeah, this has been interesting. I've actually found myself becoming more creative in quarantine. I've been making mixes like it's going out of fashion. Like honestly, I'm putting together a mix like every week or every 2 weeks, and for me, there was a point where I realized that it wasn't about, for me anyway, the public reception.
Yeah.
I'm doing this because I love to do it. It's part of my spiritual practice. It's part of my creative process. It's part of my, it's where I find my happiness. And if I'm able to touch 1, 2, 3 people even, that's amazing. But if it ends up being no one, I'm happy that I still produce this piece of content. It feels good for me to make a mix and then listen back to it and enjoy it. It doesn't need to be about someone else hearing it and then being like, oh yeah, by the way, this is sick. Because, if we base our value on external factors and external approval, then, it's a very dangerous road to go down in general. So it's been interesting. We've had to adapt, we're looking at doing live streams from our house. We're looking at exploring as many avenues as possible. This weekend, we've got quite a heavy run of things coming up, actually. We've got a 6-hour takeover of a radio station based in the UK. We've brought together a few people from our community to put together mixes. That's going to be streaming from like 6 till 12 this Friday. We're trying to play on, sorry, go on.
The radio station?
It's called Threads Radio.
And what day?
Threads. It's Friday. It starts at 6 p.m. and it finishes at 12 p.m. And it's like really a representation of the full spectrum of Eat My Beat sounds, which is, just to name a few: hip hop, techno, bass, dubstep, grime, jungle, breakbeat, but we still explore other sounds. For us, it's not about limiting by genre. And I think this is another way that we grow to reach more people than just, people within a specific genre set. Because, people who listen to hip hop exclusively might be very different to people who listen to techno, who might be very different to people who listen to house. And from that, they're going to have different opinions and they're going to have different points of view. And it's important to engage all of those people from my point of view. So I think it's really, really, that's part of why we do this as well. Like, it makes it harder, I will not lie. Like, when you put yourself in a niche, your sound becomes amplified. But when you try and say, I'm going to be part of all of these different scenes, it's a lot harder to break through. But, patience, perseverance, and staying true to your sound and staying true to the thing that's most important to you, I think is where you will find that you shine the most. And if you make it about, you're doing this because you love to do it, I think that's something that's never going to change. And a while ago, we had to just stop comparing ourselves to any other labels who are doing anything similar to us. Stop comparing ourselves to any DJs who are getting more bookings than us. Stop comparing ourselves to this release that got a better write-up, or, and from that, I actually get a lot more joy.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of brings home the point about not kind of focusing on creating within the market. We've seen that the market has changed and has flipped on its head necessarily within the past couple months. So existing within that realm isn't largely beneficial. You can't really keep up with it at its pace. So I definitely agree and hear what you're saying, and that's profound. It's just about kind of doing what feels kind of just close to your spirit and your essence, and that divinity, if you will, kind of just funnel through you.
Yeah, it's good to get opportunities like this, to be honest, to try and see how your creativity will warp and transform to suit your situation. Like, I think these are the spaces where innovation really happens. Like this is. I was speaking to a friend of mine earlier. Like we talked about Tulsa. I think Clive might be on this call somewhere. Actually, we talked about Tulsa and Black people creating wealth. That was definitely something that was born out of the war. You had a serious economic upset, and then opportunity was created, and then therefore innovation. So I think that's really how we need to be looking at this. Like, what can we do better? What can we change about the way that we're doing things now, and how can we transform that to something that leads to something better, or something that might relate to more people. Like, you know, it doesn't need to always be about growth necessarily. I think we need to be careful of that generally as a society. You know, having this constant growth mindset, it can be very damaging to people.
No.
Again, I'm going to be annoying and disrupt you right quick. I just want to do a time check. We've just passed an hour. It's flown by. It's been fire so far. I'm good to keep riffing and go deep into this. I have other avenues that I'd love to hear on. But if any of you are feeling awkward about jumping off and have things to do and go about your day and your life, I know there's people in the US and in Canada who are working right now. So please do. If not, I'm happy to keep on.
I'm still here.
We're not working here.
I mean, I'm not working either, but we're not going to tell anybody.
Yeah, this is the best thing about working from home, right? It's like working from home. Sure.
Was there something that you wanted to mention? So
yeah, if that's okay. So yesterday we had a really rich conversation with a hip hop music label, and they were just talking. I mean, we covered a bunch of things, but one of the things I found sat with me was the artist and the label's duty to their market and to their audience, and this reciprocating feedback loop of how we mold and respond to markets. So that is to say, like, the question came up about, like, what is your moral obligation as a hip hop artist? Do you need to be telling kids positive messages, or do you just create your art? And one of the things that they were saying was that, you know, it's a market position. The reason why people go down a certain avenue is so that they can create a profitable product. And so I was just curious, from the point of view of EMIB, what is your relationship with your market, and how do you guys make decisions from that?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one. It's a bit of a paradox. I would say that income isn't our driver for our business. We're fortunate in that we have careers outside of music. So we haven't gone full ham into trying to make a career off of music. And perhaps if that was the case, we would be approaching this a little bit different. You know, there's always this trade-off between trying to fit into the market that you're trying to, you know, push your content into, and there is a degree of sometimes needing to mold to that. But I find that when I'm listening to musicians, I'm always more critical of artists that I feel like aren't being authentic. You know, more critical of artists that I feel like, yeah, you probably just made this because it's going to be a hit single, and maybe it's not fair for me to think about it in that scope, because, you know, at the same time, that also may be their authentic self. Yeah, exactly. Nicole's just said it. The notion of selling out, like, it's like it's kind of a shaming thing, actually, now that I think about it. We're like, no, you're not allowed to do that because you were cool. Therefore, you're not allowed to make this kind of music, because then that will mean you're not cool, and we're not going to support you if you're not cool. And it's a lot of pressure, actually, when you think about it. So I would say it's not something that we use to base our business decisions. I think that we have a fundamental sense of, we're doing the right thing. This is the right thing. Our close-knit community are supporting us and keep telling us that the content that we're pushing is dope. So, you know, I think in terms of it becoming something that becomes profitable, I see it more like there'll be a time. And actually, if we compare how it was now to how it was maybe 3 years ago, you know, there's definitely an improvement. We didn't start a record label for it to be a profitable record label, and it's now a profitable record label, just like that, you know. So I think there is also an aspect of give it time and believe in yourself. And as long as you have a few people who are telling you that this is dope, then just keep pushing it. But manage your expectations.
Kat, one more question, I promise, before I'm getting out of your way. I'm being careful right now. But
I really don't mind. Trust me.
So just going one step deeper into this, one of the things we also covered yesterday was like how much that level of thoughtfulness and consideration is heavier on Black musicians and Black artists, because we're like, we almost have this burden of responsibility and obligation to our community to show representation at the top, selling out. And so, you know, Kat and the rest of the Eternal Remedy Toronto team and I always speak about like Drake's trajectory. Like, and I'm a fan of it. I'm like, yeah, you did that for Toronto music. You put us on the map, and now all this underground Toronto stuff is getting funding. Like, it's getting recognition at a really tangible, meaningful scale. And so I was just wondering if I could borrow some thoughts from you on like, what do you think our responsibility as Black creatives is in this conversation?
It's a really powerful point that you've just raised, and I would have never even thought about it from that perspective. You know, like just in this context, I wouldn't have said that Drake's one of my favorite artists, but the fact that, you know, other people might have then been inspired to become creatives as a result of the fact that, you know, people know about Toronto music now because of this guy. That means that we have a space, you know, and whether that music comes out sounding exactly like Drake's music, well, that's one thing. But ultimately, you know, I think it's important. I think it's actually something that I haven't really taken upon myself, and perhaps now that you've raised it in that way, it is something that I will think about going forward. Like, yeah, like it's interesting. I don't know of a lot of Black run UK labels, generally speaking, but there's recently been all these Bandcamp days, you know, where Bandcamp have been waiving their fees, and people have been like quickly pushing content because the music has just been generated, has been going directly to the artists to support them in this difficult time. And with all of this, you know, all of these race topics coming up, people have been putting together these extensive Google documents, which have like all of the Black artists in the world, like 1,800 Black artists, or I saw one the other day, which was like 100 Black run labels. And even I was like, I only know like 25 of these. So it's cool that people have managed to find all of these different projects and put them into this list. But it's also like led me to think, okay, so there are actually quite a lot more people than I thought doing this. So, you know, I need to then encourage anyone who I hear speaking about wanting to do this, who looks or sounds like me. Yeah, you should, because there is space for it, you know.
Mark, it looks like we've recruited one more person to team #sellout. So we're all about it. We're all about it.
I might need to doctor the language a little bit to make me feel more comfortable about it. Yeah, I've started trying to strip down this sort of the issue with this. Like, it was difficult for me. It was definitely difficult for me. And then I realized that I was probably being a bit elitist. And like, you know, who's to say that my point of view is better than other people's point of view? Who's to say, you know, just because, you know, I think I've got a keen ear for music, that doesn't mean that other people who rate the sounds that I would class as a sellout, you know, that their opinion isn't just as valued, you know, if not more valued in certain circles.
You're not obligated to love Drake, though. You can make.
Yeah, it's going to be hard work. Let's be honest, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But you know, if the tune bangs, the tune bangs, and that's always going to be my ethos. You know, like, I'm not going to not listen to Drake just because. You know, if Drake puts out good music, then I will listen to it and I will play it. Fact.
Yeah,
but I mean, good is subjective.
Just thinking about your point about if you do what's true to your heart and what is really real within you, that will necessarily just create a path for other people to follow regardless. And about how much of our work and our philosophies and the things that we've created as individuals, how much of it was kind of tethered to the work of the people that have come before us, you know, how informed we are because of the people, the creatives, cross-disciplinary, that have come before us, and whether or not they were engaging in their creative practice explicitly for the people like us, they did it regardless. And so they paved the way whether or not it was explicit or not. And so I think, like, again, the idea of us kind of just staying true to our truths wherever they sit within this framework will necessarily open up space for other people, like, especially across disciplines, like looking at someone like you, Ali, who's even within music, like, and then you have someone like Steph that works in psychology, and you have like Nadia who works in has her own thing on the side as well. And it's so energizing, even outside of these scopes, to look at other people and see, you know what, if they've carved out their space there, I can carve out my space here. And I think
very powerful, really powerful thoughts. I think there was something that I thought of when you were talking there. I'm not sure if I got the right thread, but it made me realize that everything is borrowed, you know, everything, especially in music, and perhaps this stems to other aspects of creativity, you know, like these are not original ideas, you know, we are connected to the community that came before us, and we are a medium that is continuing to transfer, you know, we warp these ideas to make them relevant to our current like audience, our current time relevant audience, but you know, it spans deeper than just now.
You mentioned a list of a few, just being a time check, but you mentioned a list of a few artists and writers and people who had deeply inspired you, and people that you felt were really important and pivotal in kind of your creative process. Would you mind kind of speaking a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few podcasts that I listen to religiously. The first of those is Russell Brand's podcast. A lot of people, it's funny, it's like Russell Brand's like Marmite. You either love him or you hate him. Like some people really have got a really strong dislike for him, but I think he's a genius. And he is incredibly intelligent. And he obviously is a creative, a stand-up comedian. And he is like outwardly one of the most vulnerable people that I think you hear speaking about his experience. And vulnerability is really important, you know. I think if you can be humble in your vulnerability, you're more likely to express authentic creativity. And he puts all of these different people on, you know, different genders, different colors, different demographics, different political views. And I think that sort of really helped to develop my creative understanding, and try and it sort of just like stems on from not trying to pigeonhole myself, you know, not trying to exist within an echo chamber. So yeah, I would always really recommend to listen to Russell Brand's podcasts. They are on the Luminary platform. So in terms of race and race discussions, my sister is now the best-selling New York Times best-selling and Sunday Times best-selling author of Me and White Supremacy, which is incredible, very, very thought-provoking, very, very, I don't even know the words for it. Let's just say the first time I read it, I was like, oh my God, I was stressed. I had to like interview her and be like, are you kidding me right now? This is how you're putting your content out. But the more I think about it, I'm just like, I'm so glad you've done this. You know, you've created this space where people can be unapologetically themselves within their blackness, you know, and it's really challenging for white people to read this book and do this book, because it's not a storybook, it's a workbook, you know. And a lot of my friends have been telling me, I get very frequent messages now being like, oh, I'm watching your sister, or I'm listening to your sister, or, you know, I've just done this chapter and I noticed that my first reaction is that it's bringing up really uncomfortable feelings. And I'm like, good. It's good that that's happening. Like, we've needed this to happen for a while. So I just want to send a little nod to anyone within the Black community who's putting out work which is like challenging and making people feel uncomfortable and making people feel like they need to do that self-reflection work. And just to mention very quickly to the phrase of doing the work, I think people need to like put a little bit more context around that very vague phrase. I think I mentioned to you there's a UK-based lyricist, poet. He does basically everything, to be honest. His name is Akala. He's the first person that really encouraged me to grow my dreadlocks. He's amazing. He's a grime artist. He's a storyteller, and he just traverses all of these different creative disciplines comfortably. Miss Dynamite's and he's Miss Dynamite's brother, just like that. He engages in politics, and I would say he's definitely an inspiration. And apparently he's live on Instagram right now. Big up, Ela. That's a good shout. So yeah, I would recommend checking out his work and just listening to the guy talk. His book Natives. It's all about institutionalized racism and colonialism and the colonial history of the UK, which for a lot of people who think that the UK is not, within the scope of this discussion of racism, think again. We're the pioneers. We started this shit.
You say that. It's true, and but you find the same thing in Canada as well, that often, especially, there was no decolonial project that didn't exist, and so often like this veil is just kind of pulled over everything, and everybody's just looking towards America and forgetting about everything that happens all over the world, right? In Brazil, in Australia, in Canada, in everywhere. So that's really a nice lights you got there.
Thanks. Yeah. We got some fairy lights up in here. Just adds to the mood, right?
Well, I guess we'll kind of wind down now. I'm gonna say, like, deep thank you to you. It's been such a rich few days. Like, we're so grateful on behalf of everybody to have been able to share this with you. Like, your perspective and your experiences have been just profound, and you've added like extreme insight, and it's just been such a beautiful time just being able to share, and thank you for everybody for being here with us. I don't know if you want to say,
thank you.
Want to say anything to close? Anybody?
Mark,
I can speak.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I've been cooking this entire time and dealing with the kitchen, so I've just only been listening, but it's been such a blessing to have you here speaking to us. All the things you spoke about just inspired me in my own life. I thought I was inspired yesterday, but I feel like there's so much more room for inspiration. So thank you for joining us, and thank everybody for joining as well. Franny's like, what did I cook? Get out of here, I'm trying to talk. But thank you everybody. This is magical. Love you all.
That's really kind of you. Appreciate you, Evan, and I really appreciate you both, Kat, Stefan, and Francis, and everyone else for your contributions. It's really been like a riveting talk, and I'm definitely going away from this feeling more educated. It's really important to have these spaces where people are coming in with their differing opinions and their different points of view and their different ideas and their different inspirations. And I think you're able to cover so much more ground in a short space of time when you do it on these sort of forums. So yeah, it's been really amazing. Can I take a second to plug a few things after this?
You must plug.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, I mentioned it already. This Friday, 6 till midnight GMT, Threads Radio, threadsradio.com. Eat My Beat, 6 hours of strictly full fat shellers. Link in comments. This Sunday, Subtle FM or Subtle Radio, you can find it on both platforms. Black Lives Matter takeover all day, 100% music from Black artists all day. I'm dropping a cheeky half-hour mix, which is going to span a little bit of hip hop, a little bit of bass, a little bit of techno, a little bit of funky. My girl Ila Brugal is going to drop a mix for that as well. She's in here somewhere. Monday, this coming Monday, we're dropping our next release. It's by Kinsman. They're from the Netherlands. 5-track EP, 2 really, really wicked remixes on there. Please show some love, support, however you feel is appropriate. Even just by sharing it would be great. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there. I could keep them.
That was wicked though.
Keep going.
I'm gonna do one plug for you, Ali. Check their quarantine mix on SoundCloud. Follow them.
Yes.
Follow them on Instagram. Eat My Beats. I Can Eat is a 3.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, we put up a new mix every week. I think we're on number 8 now, but I think I've got about 14 recorded. So I'm just drip feeding them in. The quarantine. Also Friday the 18th, doing a show on Nudes Radio, Bristol-based radio station. Going to be spinning some UK garage for the first time in bloody ages. So if you want to know what producers are putting out garage, tune into that. That's going to be from 8 till 9. I might drop some of these in the comments, but we've just said a lot of things.
Lovely.
Thank you. One
You guys are amazing.
One last final remark. Kat, you put on your crown today. You wore it boldly. Thank you for hosting, creating, challenging, bringing us home, all the good stuff. We appreciate you greatly. Kat is hosting these every Wednesday for the next few weeks. So please, if you're about her vibes, come back here next Wednesday at this time. But, and just as important, we have this session continuing Saturday with another queen herself, Nadia, who's been trickling in thoughts and remarks throughout this conversation. 12 p.m. Eastern time, which is 5 p.m. UK time. You must be there for that. We have a really good guest. It's going to be fire. So if you can recover from the hangover of the Eat My Beat mix the night before, be there at 12 p.m. with Nadia.
That was slick. I like that. That was a good plug.
That was a good plug. That with bells on. Looking forward to it.
I just wrote that in there. Cool.
Kat, I just want to also echo Stefan's comments. You're an incredible host. I really, really appreciate the direction that you took us through in this journey. You're really, really great at asking questions and really getting to the core of things. So yeah, really, really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well. It's been really great.
All right, y'all. Thank you. We'll speak soon.
Thank you so
Take
much.
care, everyone. Till we meet again.
Much love.
Bye. Big love. Big love.